Okay, welcome to the Scotonomics Festival of Economics, the Leith iteration. So, hello everyone. If you don't know me, I'm Karen Van Sweden and I'm an Aberdeen City Councillor and I'm also co-host of Scotonomics. So, over to you, William.
Hello, thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I'd like to introduce you to Professor Brett Christophers.
I've got the rest of the introduction. So, few people know more about the UK economy really than Professor Brett Christophers. So we are delighted that Professor Christophers is here to open our 2025 Festival of Economics. Brett was born in Croydon, but we've just discovered his nan was from Leith. What about that? Yeah. He's currently working at Uppsala University in Sweden. Yet, Professor Christophers just can't stop writing about the UK, even when he's set out to write about the USA. So, whilst researching his 2020 book, Rentier Capitalism, Brett was sure that the US had to be the most capitalist nation. But after a little bit of research, all reading roads led to the UK winning that title. In Rentier Capitalism, Brett wrote, the UK has come to be seen as the world's undisputed privatisation trailblazer. So, then in 2023, our lives in their portfolios, Professor Christophers explains how BlackRock not only owns your home, it also owns the land from which your food originates, the wind farm that generates your electricity, the road you drive to work on, and much of else besides. So, it seems our lives almost depend on BlackRock, as it often decides to commercialise those various proprietary real assets. In his 2025 book, The Price is Wrong, Brett discusses the UK electricity market and asks, why does the most expensive generator set the price for all? A good question indeed, which elicited much head scratching and at the time of the writing. So, well, tonight we're going to set out the answer to the question and other head scratchers. Can you give Professor Christophers a big round of applause?
Thanks so much for the introduction. I'm going to structure the interview in 3 different sections, so I really want as many questions from you as possible. We're going to start with a general understanding of where you are from an economic perspective, and then we're going to go into land and ownership, and then finally we're going to talk about Scotland's renewables. Within that, there'll be lots of other things from Brett's 4 books. And yes, I am a fan, and they're all mine. So we've got round about an hour and a half. Are you up for it?
Yeah.
Okay, right, let's go. All you need to do, raise your hand, and I'll come to you for the questions, okay? But not the first question. Okay, now you are a political economist and an economic geographer. So would you like to explain those terms to us, please?
Oh, good God. So first of all, it's really nice to be here. Thanks for having me. And yeah, it's lovely to be in Leith, given a little bit of family history. My nan's dad was actually a docker, although I think that was before there was a Leith Dockers Club. But it's really, really nice to be here. So yeah, I mean, those are just kind of, I guess they're labels that get applied sometimes by me, sometimes by other people. Basically, I'm a geographer. I trained as a human geographer. But if you say to people you're a geographer and you're talking about the economy, they switch off straight away. So you make up another label, which for me is I sometimes refer to myself as a political economist. And all I really mean by that is that I try to understand the economy, but through I guess intellectual traditions other than contemporary mainstream economics. And so for me, I guess I use the label political economist for 2 main reasons. One is just to signal the fact that when we're trying to think about the economy, I think this is very, very important. To my mind, what we should never do is kind of understand the economy as this kind of sector of life that is cleaved off from the rest of society, that's cleaved off from culture, that's cleaved off from the environment, that's cleaved off, last but not least, from politics, but as something that's always fundamentally political at every level, saturated with political decisions in every single respect. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is to signal that in terms of the types of thinkers who I typically draw upon to understand economic questions, it tends to be thinkers who themselves were understood as being political economists, not least Marx, but not only Marx. So there's those two things, I guess, are the main reasons.
Great, and that's we can certainly define that as a heterodox perspective of the world, can't we? You know, and we're looking at kind of orthodox being a mainstream, a kind of neoclassical view, which sees the economy as something separate and also guided by iron laws and rules and things that you can apply to every situation. And then the alternative, which is what we cover, I'm sure as some of you know, is this alternative approach that looks at the economy and said, you know, power plays a really important role in this. People's historical understanding of how things are and how they will go have an impact in this. So it's a very different take. When I read your books, I look at what you're talking about through an institutional economic lens. I'll kind of go into that and I'll explain what that is for the audience, but is that a term that you also would class yourself happily under, or not so much?
Again, I tend not to think too much about labels and categories, but what I would, so when you talk, so institutional economics, people typically think about early 20th century economists like John Commons and Torsten Veblen, when they talk about institutional economics. And very very simply, it was a type of economics that put institutions at the centre of the analysis rather than the individual, an individual kind of rationality, maximising behaviour and so on, at the centre of the analysis. And yeah, I mean, to the extent that I absolutely focus on institutions, I think that's true. I mean, another way I tend to think about the type of work I do is that it's very kind of it's very sort of business focused. I'm another way of thinking about what I do is kind of critical business studies. So it's like business studies, but from a critical perspective. So instead of trying to understand like mainstream business schools do, how businesses should go about maximising revenues and profitability, critical business studies is thinking critically about the role of business institutions in society and in the economy. And so that's another way of thinking about the type of work I do, is just thinking critically about the role of institutions like BlackRock, but not only BlackRock, in contemporary society. And the other thing I would add about that is that for me, a lot of that is actually not shaped at all by my sort of academic life. But I spent about 7 years working as a business consultant in London, working for a management consultancy, and pretty much everything I learned of any value about kind of how capitalism works was during those 7 years working kind of within the belly of the beast, so to speak, as understanding from the inside rather than from the outside about how that world works. But no, absolutely, institutions are at the centre of it.
And when I read the price is wrong, which is, when you start, you think, right, okay, what are you going to cover here? Is it the worldwide energy market? And then you go, no, it's not the worldwide energy market. And you go, okay, is it the worldwide renewables market? No, it's not the renewable market. It's just wind and solar. And I'm looking at this 400-page book, and I'm thinking, just wind and solar?
Yeah.
And it really is maybe surprisingly, but it's a really fascinating read, and I think that's the level of detail that we need to get into to properly understand something like renewables. And what I think tends to happen is that a neoclassical approach is to look at renewables and say, well, it's electricity, the market is a solution for that. And I think with your analysis, which we'll go into in a little bit more detail, you kind of say, well, maybe, but let's look at it in detail. And I think that's what's missing in our mainstream economic approach, is to just say, hold on, let's look at this and let's assume that we don't know what the answer is, rather than saying we need to reduce government spending or we need to treat this as a market. And that's where I think it says you get some really fascinating insights from the books. So you're from Croydon, but kind of from Leith. How did you end up? How did you end up where you are now, which is in Uppsala University in Sweden?
Oh, that's just a purely. I have a Swedish wife. That's why I'm in Sweden. Yeah. That's what took me there, and then I've been very happy to be there ever since. So I've been there for 17 years now. And Sweden's a pretty decent place to live in the big scheme of things.
Yeah. So when you come back to the UK,
yes,
what do you see as the main differences? And maybe we'll get to the end and say why are these the main differences. But what do you see? Because 17 years is a long time to be away. What do you see as the big differences?
Crumbling infrastructure. Frankly, is probably the main thing. I mean, Sweden has lots of negatives as well as various positives as well. But things typically work quite well in Sweden. Things typically get maintained quite well. And often when I come back to the UK, that's the thing that's most striking to me. I think the other thing, I mean, we're kind of getting off the topic a little bit, but the other thing is that it feels like the high street has changed a lot more in the UK than in Sweden. Like I'm from Croydon. If you go back to Croydon now, the high street has just been kind of decimated. I mean, all is kind of either vape shops or betting shops or real estate agents, and there's not much, and pound lands, and there's not much else. Whereas in Sweden, it feels like things have changed much less in that. So there's a much more vibrant kind of public retail sphere, for want of a better description, than in the UK. So the kind of infrastructure of social life feels like it's degenerated, for want of a better word. Not universally, of course, around the country. Coming to Leith, tram system that seems to be functioning very well, but it certainly across the UK in general, it feels like infrastructure is a real problem in the UK, but not just in the UK.
And do you notice any difference from when you're back in Croydon to anywhere else in the UK, or do you think this is I know you said it's not universal, but do you think this is something that stretches right across the UK? It's not just a Scotland issue.
I think it's a general issue. Yeah.
Okay. So the first detailed question is in the Price is Wrong, you highlight that metric of price in the world of renewables is not the right one. Now, can you explain first the role of price for the mainstream of economics, and then can you kind of talk about the general problem with price from a kind of real world perspective, and then we can go into why it doesn't work specifically for renewables, because I think this is fascinating, specifically for a Scottish audience who are well aware of the perceived potential of renewables in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, that's an enormous question, which I can't, it's impossible to do justice to that question, partly because, mainstream economics is a huge field, which is internally very, very variegated. It comes in all sorts of different shapes and forms. But I think it's impossible to overstate the extent to which price and the price mechanism are central to the mainstream kind of edifice, the kind of intellectual architecture of mainstream economics. In a way, everything is about price. The price mechanism is at the centre of mainstream economic understanding, both descriptively and analytically, but also normatively. And what I mean by that is the idea not only that the price mechanism and the markets through which the price mechanism works are central to how the mainstream tradition understands the world, but also the view that the price mechanism and markets are the most efficient way of organising society in general, not just the economy, but society in general. And to to kind of radically simplify a very complex set of arguments, the basic idea is that the price mechanism is a superior means of conveying information. That prices of particular products, particular commodities, congeal all relevant information about patterns of supply and demand.
Because the price is always right, isn't it? That's the understanding, that the price is always right.
Exactly. And the price mechanism both conveys information but also sends signals to different economic agents about how they should optimise their behaviour. So, for example, during the energy crisis, when the price of electricity went up, the idea would be that consumers respond to that by reducing their demand for electricity, and demand and supply come back into balance through the price mechanism. So price is absolutely central to the mainstream tradition in terms of incentives, in terms of conveying and receiving information. Everything revolves around the price mechanism. And I think, it just in the second part of the question about what some of the limitations are to that, I think there are critics, not least people coming at economic questions from more heterodox perspectives, have over decades now pointed to a whole host of different problems with that. Just to highlight two, which I would say are particularly important. One comes back to something you mentioned earlier, which is the fact that the mainstream tradition generally presumes that economic agents are price takers, by which I mean they don't have the power to set prices. They receive prices and are almost relatively powerless actors who respond to price signals but don't set prices. And the mainstream tradition has always therefore had problems with things like oligopoly and monopoly and power more generally. It doesn't. As soon as the questions of power, questions of monopoly get taken up in the mainstream tradition, that causes all sorts of problems to some of the core assumptions of that tradition. So questions of power, I think, are one thing that have always been problematic for that tradition to understand and integrate. I think the second one is and in a way is more obvious, which is that that tradition has also always had problems with integrating the value of non-monetary based things, where there isn't a price because there isn't a monetary calculus attached to those things. Things like the environment, things like beauty, things that are not priced in markets in real life. They try to impute prices to those things. But it's never very straightforward.
I think we're all aware of that, aren't we? When there's things like the natural environment, and for some reason they have to have a price to be able to fit in with this overall overall narrative and this concept of there being a price. One of the examples I like to discuss is, and it was just recently in Edinburgh, where it was expected that 11% of families would take their kids out of private school because of a 20% increase in VAT. And I think that's something like 5,500 kids in Edinburgh. And obviously this was a narrative put across by the representative body for private schools. But that they're sitting with policymakers and they're saying when the price goes up, people will reduce their spending, and it's one of those things that most people would say, well, yeah, that's obviously what happens. We all know that if something becomes more expensive, but we're lacking that deeper understanding of something. But that doesn't apply to something like private school, where it's a ceremonial purchase, and actually putting the price up won't affect that. And do you know how many kids moved from private to public school after the VAT increase? No, there was 58. So not 5,500, but there was 58, and obviously those 58 could have moved for a whole variety of different reasons. But this is a really important point, because when we're having conversations with policymakers, price is something that they understand. So it's really easy to have that conversation, trying to explain that it's not the metric that they think it is really interesting. Gregory Hayden, who's one of my favourite economists, he said one of the things about price is, as soon as you start speaking about price, you go to certain people for advice, which are accountants and economists, and already you're steering this narrative towards one particular part of society, and you're missing all the advice from everything else. Because if you want an expert on money, you go to the people who are experts on money. So it might just seem like a simple, obvious area to look at, but it has huge impact on how we approach in general our economic conversations. Yeah. Would anyone like to throw in any comments or questions at this point? So we're just kind of talking about a general understanding of an orthodox approach, and also and comparing that to an orthodox or a mainstream approach. Any questions? Okay, we've got one at the back. We don't have a roving mic, so if you wouldn't mind, if you could just stand up and ask the question, I'm sure we'll hear you from here.
Just following that point there. I work in the environment and climate change, and your points about the markets can't take into account things which aren't priced is well understood. But isn't it a bit of a shift now that we need to elevate non-market outcomes to the most high level that the object of our economic policy has to be to stop climate change and environmental destruction, which is a different critique. It's like, actually, you've got to make an economic system do something which is not, even in its own terms, designed for. So I wonder if you've got any comments that it's not just, it was never a good plan. It is that we have so messed up things that we've now got to change the power to control those outcomes.
I mean, maybe I don't know if we're going to get to climate questions later. I mean, I think that there's so much. I mean, it's a very broad, very broad question. I think that it's. Let's put it this way. I think that the way in which the mainstream tradition understands climate change is as a massive problem of market failure, by which we mean that basically the market has failed precisely because there hasn't been a so-called proper price placed upon the negative externalities that that greenhouse gas emissions represent. And the idea is that if you accurately price those emissions, which is essentially a carbon price, which can take all sorts of different forms, like a carbon tax, then you effectively will kind of incentivize actors to shift towards cleaner activities. There's a whole host of different critiques of why that hasn't and doesn't happen.
Which we might get to in a wee bit more detail.
Yeah, I mean, but it's really hard to know where to start there because it's such a massive question. I'm not really sure whether we want to go there now. Yeah, I mean, it's an enormous can of worms.
Yeah, I think it's important just to point out, the economy is socially constructed. So it's just at the moment it looks like it's not important and we're not trying to solve it, but we could structure the economy. It's man-made in a way that it could solve all these problems and prioritise all these problems. It's the mainstream approach that we're struggling, that we're using, that means we're struggling to solve these problems. They're infinitely solvable. We could do that without any problem. It's the issues we've got on the economic front at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to that is the only thing I guess my view on this is that, in a sense, I think that the world's failure to grapple meaningfully with the climate problem, I think that the influence of economists and economics is part of that, but I think it's a pretty small part. I think at the end of the day, it's a lack of political will, which is a much bigger question than the influence of economic reasoning one way or another.
Well, let's come back to that. Any other kind of mainstream concepts that you would have a little bit of an issue with? So we spoke about price not always being right, and we spoke about this idea of market failure, and I think also you're kind of talking about a little bit like a carbon tax being the thing that solves the problem, externalities. Any other big issue there that you've got a problem with?
So I have to say that I'm not a big one for sort of like critiques of mainstream economics, mainly because I think that's been done. Like there's such a huge, last 20 or 30 years, there's been an enormous amount of like people you had here last year, like Steve Keen. There's so much that's been said and done about the limitations of mainstream economics. I find it much more fruitful to do positive analyses through other analytical lenses, for example, and try to rather than spend my time thinking about the limitations of the mainstream tradition. I think the other thing I would say is that I do think that mainstream economics has changed quite a lot particularly in the last decade. I think it's now a much more empirical discipline than it was. I think particularly up until the financial crisis, it was very, very theory-led, and so to the framing of this session, the economics of the real world, I think then, up until that point in time, mainstream economics was much more divorced from the real world than it is now. I think it's now a much more empirical-led discipline. It's much more interested in analysis of empirical data. I think it still does it in very limited ways, but I do think it has become more engaged with quote unquote the real world than it was historically when theory was what gave you kind of kudos in the mainstream economic world. Now it's like big data analysis and finding patterns in those analysis and trying to use statistical techniques that show correlations and causations in that analysis. So I think it has changed quite a lot, but it's still framing the world, and most importantly only asking a very narrow set of questions. To me, that's the issue more. It's not so much the tools or techniques that are used, it's the range of questions that get asked, which I personally find quite limited.
Well, that's certainly an interesting perspective. I'd like to hear what the audience think, because I'm certainly looking at where we are now with a return to austerity, and it looks like exactly the same arguments that were incredibly, not just flimsy, but disproved in 2008. I mean, you know, that kind of famous spreadsheet, and you know the other couple of research papers that basically just led to almost a decade of austerity in the UK. It seems to be back.
It is
so
back.
Can I just ask the audience, do you feel there's been a shift and the kind of economic...
But can I come in there? It is back, but what I would say is that I think that is a political narrative. It's a political narrative about the economy, which I think is frankly completely divorced from what's going on in the scholarly world. And it's a political narrative that is, it's based upon very, very little in terms of informed economic analysis. I think even within the mainstream now, you would have economists that are basically saying, no, that's absolutely not.
Well, not the one who's the Chancellor at the moment.
No, but.
So you're saying there's a distinction between that kind of academic, which is weighty, and the feeding through to policy.
Yeah, massive.
Okay. Just a quick raise of hands, and then I'll come to you for that specific question. But do you feel like there's been a shift in the economic or the political understanding of the economy from 2008? So hands up if you think there's been a change. Okay, and then I'll assume everyone else thinks there hasn't been a change since 2000.
No, I mean I think in the political understanding there has.
Yeah.
I mean it's just but I think the discipline of economics has changed quite a lot. Yeah. Okay, but it isn't reflected in policy at all.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Yes, question please.
Well, maybe first just a comment, if that's okay.
Of course.
I don't think austerity went away. I think it just hasn't been talked about as austerity. And I couldn't answer the previous question because I haven't been following economics, so I couldn't say whether the approach has changed or not. But I wondered, coming back to your first question, to Brad, I didn't quite understand what a human geographer meant. I'd like to understand that and how it affects the way that you consider economics.
Yeah.
I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so just in case no one heard that.
That's a good question.
Yeah. So what is a human geographer? Answer the question, Brett.
Yeah.
And how does it affect your view?
Yeah. So geography as a kind of subject, as a way of thinking about the world, has always been split into two. Physical geography, which is like mountains and rivers and slopes and stuff like that. And then human geography is a really odd discipline, but it's my discipline, so I'm kind of fond of it. And the best way I can explain human geography is that it's like a melange of all the other social sciences, but with a particular interest in geographical aspects. So, for example, instead of sociology, there's like social geography. Instead of history, there's historical geography. Instead of economics, there's economic geography. And basically, what it basically does is it takes all the other social sciences, and then it asks questions that are interested in things like place and space. So, for economic geographers would be interested in, historically, they would have been interested in questions like industrial location. So, why do you get certain types of economic activities that cluster in particular places? Why do you get rents on agricultural land that differ between different places in certain degrees? So they're interested in the spatial relationships of society and of the economy. They're interested in place and space and those particular dimensions. And more broadly, and I guess this is where the environment comes in, geographers are very interested in the relationship between the natural environment and society, and that the basic, I guess, if there's a basic ethos at the centre of human geography, it's that society shapes the landscape, the physical landscape, but the physical landscape also shapes us as social beings as well. So it's very interested in human environment relations and the kind of reciprocal relation between humans and environments. That's a kind of very capsule overview of the discipline. But it's a very kind of liberating discipline. It's a discipline where kind of anything goes, which I think is both its strength and its weakness, in the sense that it allows you to take your inquiry wherever you want to take it, but it doesn't have the kind of, for want of a better word, the kind of rigour and canon and orthodoxy of certain other disciplines, which I think is both liberating but also somewhat problematic as well. So it's a like all social scientific disciplines, it has its own history. But that's the best I can do in a very short space of time. It's like everything else, but it's interested particularly in geographical questions.
Great. Yes.
Hey, so you said you started off in working in the city.
Yes.
And then you end up as a human geographer.
Yes.
And when you were in the city, what were your politics, and what took you? I mean, did you get that by accident, or what? Yeah, what was the journey?
Yeah. His granny was from Leith. You know his politics.
Yeah. It's a really good question. I ended up in that world, not the city, but like consulting, management consulting. Basically, because I had no clue what else to do with my life, and I needed to earn some money, and I'd gone to a half-decent university, and it was like that was what people who didn't know what the heck to do with their lives. If you wanted to, you did it. As soon as I started it, I knew I didn't want to do it for very long. But the thing about that world is that you're being paid, living in London, earning a half-decent wage. You think, I'll do it for another year, and then they put your money up a little bit, and you think do it, and then you get a kid, and you get married, and then obviously most people end up just staying in that world. But for me, I knew that I didn't want to stay in that world forever. But I did think that I was learning stuff that was really that was quite interesting. I didn't entirely hate working in that world. There was actually some stuff about working in that world which I look back on quite fondly. So academia, where my world now is a very kind of self-oriented world. It's very egotistical. People are very interested in themselves. It's quite a narcissistic world at sometimes. People are very precious about their ideas. It's very kind of it's not everyone, but lots of people in academia are, and it's very sort of self-oriented. So actually, the consulting world wasn't really like that. It was actually quite team-oriented, and you kind of wanted your colleagues to do well because then everyone did well. And academia is actually not like that a lot of the time. So I kind of, people on the, we on the left tend to have this kind of, very kind of sometimes very lazy critique of that world, but there are actually very positive aspects of that world that I found as well, which I don't find in the world in which I'm in now. But at the end of the day, I knew I didn't want to do it forever, but I thought, I'd do it for long enough to be able to save up a little bit of money to then go and do a PhD. And I'm basically now just studying the same world as I was studying then, but just asking completely different questions about that world than I was doing when I was working in that world. Actually, people working in that world have a complete range of politics as well. It's not like everyone that works in that world is a die-hard Tory. Of course they're not. The reality is that we live in a capitalist society, so most people work for capitalist institutions. That's the reality of that's just obvious. And so there's a complete range of politics of people in that world, but people need to earn a wage, right? And so people end up in a whole range of different jobs.
Great, thank you. Simon?
Where in Scotland we don't own our natural resources, we've sold off our wind or whatever, what happens over time? Does it revert back to state when the contract runs out, or is it like a house that gets sold off to someone?
So stuff that, it depends on what type of assets you're talking about. So lots of assets that are held by the private sector have been sold, but lots of things get I guess leased under long-term concessions or contracts. So, for example, lots of lots of things like PFI. We might talk about PFI later. But lots of stuff that gets done and is held by the private sector is under long-term contracts that ultimately revert to the public sector, but not until after like 50 years or something like that. So it completely depends upon the situation. It depends on what type of asset you're talking about.
Great. Final question on this part then. You've mentioned a few economists throughout the first half an hour there. Could you give me maybe an economist who you haven't mentioned, but also a kind of like, let's say you're having dinner and you're able to invite two economists, dead or alive. Who joins you for dinner?
Well, I think in terms of people working today, I would say that there are certainly some really good people who are very much within the mainstream, who are worth listening to and learning from. So someone like Paul Krugman, for example, is very much a mainstream economist, but he's just stopped recently, but he's been writing a column for the New York Times for the last 15, 20 years or so, and he's incredibly informative and informed and in some ways quite radical, but he's absolutely coming at things from a mainstream perspective. And then in the UK,
he seems to have the blinkers off, though, I would say.
Yeah, but he's still methodologically and kind of in terms of how he understands the world, he's absolutely a mainstream economist. Within the UK, there's a great economist working at Cambridge called Diane Coyle, who I think is, again, very mainstream, but super interesting and informative. So those would be two people on the mainstream side. In terms of the
Are they coming for dinner, those two?
Yeah, and then on the heterodox side, I would say someone you can't, you absolutely should always listen to is Adam Tooze. He's a historian as well as an economist, but he's always worth listening to. And then one other heterodox person would be someone like Isabella Weber. Not sure how you pronounce it. She's German, so probably Weber. Is another person who I think is always worth listening to. So those two from the mainstream side. Two from the
and what about economists from the past then? Kind of who would you like to have for dinner? Who's dead? And they're not going to eat any of the food.
I mean, for me, it's always Marx, just because he's so fun and entertaining to read. He's humorous. He's savage. His work is littered with kind of literary references as well as, analysis, deep analysis of how cotton's getting produced and so on. So no one measures up to him.
Right, so we're going to turn to the UK, and I'm going to consider a couple of points in your book, The New Enclosure, which I think is the oldest one in that little stack.
Of those four, yeah.
Yep. So let's start with land. Can you first explain what the enclosure was? And then can you explain the new enclosure? Some of you